Thank you all for joining this discussion about migration and refugees. This is a critical topic at a critical time, and we have a stupendous panel to address this issue. I'd like to thank the World Refugee and Migration Council and the Aspen Institute's Aspen Ministers Forum for organizing the event. And also note that today's event is also supported through a council partnership with CUSO International. We're gonna start off having a discussion among ourselves, but I also invite all of those of you watching to put those on the panel on the spot by asking questions using the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. Toward the end of the discussion, we'll come to those questions. So please feel free at any time to add those questions in the Q&A function. So for our panel, a panel that literally needs no introduction, but Madeleine Albright, of course, was Secretary of State. Also, in this context, honorary chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council. Lloyd Axworthy is formerly Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs and now chairs the World Refugee and Migration Council. And Mayu Brizuela de Avila was El Salvador's Minister of Foreign Affairs and is now a commissioner of the International Commission on Missing Persons. So Secretary Albright, let me start off with you. So we now understand that President-elect Biden, as one of his first acts, will take on the issue of refugees and immigration with a package to be announced tomorrow. And his strategy apparently will be one that he also embraced as vice president, which is to try to address the underlying forces that drive people from, for example, Central America, drive them north toward the US. Now, so my question for you is, is that feasible? Can that work, either in the case of Central America or in the case of Venezuela or anywhere else? You've thought a lot about this because one of your other roles is at the National Democratic Institute, where you are the chair, trying to build in democratic movements, small d democratic movements. So can that strategy work?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be on this panel with two very good friends, actually three very good friends. Nick and I know each other from a variety of things, and delighted to be dealing with what is one of the more complicated issues that has to be dealt with today. So thank you very much. I really do think that, by the way, I am a refugee. I came to the United States when I was 11 years old from Czechoslovakia. And I do believe that people would prefer to live in the country where they were born. They have family, they have language, they have the environment, and most people don't just want to pick up and go live somewhere else. I do think that one of the issues really is that the people that come to the United States or other countries do it because they cannot live where they are living, either because of the economic situation or because of the dangers of living there in terms of criminal activities, drugs, or in fact, something to do with the environment. And so they are trying to figure out how to make a living and how to exist. And I really believe that. I do know, I happen to know President-elect Biden very well from all the years in the Senate and the things that we have done together in the past. And he took a particular interest in Central America, looking at what could be done because of the environment that we were hearing about, the things that were going on and people picking up and leaving. And so as he is putting out his plan, he is aware of the discrepancies in terms of which is the kindest word I can think of for what the Trump administration was doing in terms of immigration regulations and bans and lack of support, and calling people that wanted to come to the United States as criminals and rapists. But what Biden wants to do is to change all that. And one of the things that I think he is prepared to do is to think about what can be done to change the conditions within the countries, especially the Northern Triangle, where the people cannot live properly and are concerned and are terrified, frankly. We are now dealing, at least it's in the news, with a caravan of people that are on their way to the United States because they can't live in Honduras. And so they are pushing through Guatemala on their way to Mexico. And I think there are real questions about how that is going to be handled. But I do think that what will have to happen, and the immigration policy is going to take a while, it's going to take a whole of government, it's going to take cooperation between the executive and legislative branch. But I do think that there are mechanisms now in place where there can be some help so that people will be able to live where they were born. And so there's this new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation that is able to mobilize the private sector to do things. There is USAID. There are ways that the mechanism exists for the United States, along with other countries, to try to change what are the conditions that are forcing people to leave. But it's going to take a while. And you mentioned the National Democratic Institute. I'm very proud to chair that. And one of the things that NDI is doing is looking at some of the issues that have to do with the rule of law, corruption particularly, and also how to get civil society involved in things, how to have groups of citizens that have a voice that can explain what needs to be fixed. And so, and working not only in each country, but regionally, sub-regionally, to get some kind of cooperation on developing an infrastructure that allows people to state what the problems are and to be part of the problem solving cadre, really, of those that want to change things. So I think there are huge opportunities. I think it's going to take a while. And I think that's part of the issue. Just generally, patience is very hard when people have been suffering.
Can I push back a little bit? And I say that as one who, basically agrees with you. And I wrote a lot of pieces about the importance of addressing those underlying conditions. But I also, frankly, have a certain skepticism about our capacity to change the degree of corruption, of drug cartels, of poverty that are factors that drive people. And this is something that, as you say, that Biden worked on in the Obama administration, and it frankly didn't work terribly well in the Obama administration, which is why they had to get Mexico to try to push people back. You look at Eritrea, another country that has sent so many people abroad. I mean, we've had decades to try to make Eritrea less repressive, less brutal. And so, clearly we should try these approaches. In Honduras, there in some towns, there were some progress, but is this really going to be a plausible pillar of a policy to address migration?
I think it will be a plausible pillar, but that does not say it will be easy. There's nothing about this that is easy, and it is going to require dedication by the US government, which for starters is not easy because if one looks at the agenda that President Biden has laid out for himself and his administration, it frankly blows your mind. I mean, there are so many things that need to be done, and they are integrated in many ways. We are dealing with a problem of the pandemic. We are dealing with the problem of our own economy, and also with a very divided society. And then we can talk about the makeup of the legislature, where it's not totally evenly divided, because there are a few more House members that are Democrats, but certainly evenly divided in the Senate. And all these actions require cooperation and dedication and patience, which is very difficult given what the situation is. But I do think that if it's not on the agenda and it's not understood as basic, certainly nothing will happen. And it requires very much cooperation of a variety of non-governmental organizations like the Refugee Council or people that have understanding of things, along with the governmental structures, a dedication and an understanding that it is hard. I'm not saying it's easy, and I have yet to talk to anybody in the Biden administration that thinks that it's easy. So, but it's essential. Nothing will happen if there is not work done basically in countries so that people will be able to make a living without fear. That doesn't mean that immigration will be totally eliminated. There are so many other parts of things in terms of reunification of families, or the fact that there are those who will want to come to the United States. And by the way, recently I was at a dinner party and I was asked to describe myself in 6 words. And I said, worried optimist, problem solver, grateful American. And I am a grateful American who was allowed to come here as an immigrant. That's why I've got my Statue of Liberty pin on.
I think those 6 words captured it pretty well. Minister Axworthy, let me ask you in particular about Venezuela, which is certainly the heart of the one of the crucial problems, not only in the Americas, but globally. 5 million people fleeing the country. Our efforts have not been very successful. I mean, thank God for Colombia, which are actually ordinary Colombians, I think have been quite remarkable in being willing to accept vast numbers of Venezuelans. But what can we do to address the underlying conditions or any element of this vast humanitarian crisis in Venezuela that is causing now a regional crisis?
Well, Nicholas, first again, I want to say I'm really pleased to be in your company and Madeleine and Mayu on the topic. I think really does demand a lot of serious thought, and not just thought about what was, but how do we open up to think a little bit more? Are the ways of really resetting and revitalizing some of the basic commitments we made? And let's start with the region. I mean, Venezuela, as you point out, is not just a one-off problem with one country, and it's a plague that it brings into its neighborhood by the sort of mass surge of people that are trying to escape the suppression and the poverty. It's a worldwide problem. I think Madeleine put her finger on one angle of it: corruption. Venezuela is perhaps one of the most corrupt regimes in the world. The Swiss government announced 2 days ago there's over $10 billion of Swiss money sitting in their banks. I suspect that's tripled in banks in Miami. I know it's probably true here. It's probably true at most financial centers. That's a huge sort of impact when you withdraw that kind of currency and revenue from providing proper security for people themselves. You've created a huge black hole. And I think that that's what we're beginning to face. That Venezuela impinges on so many other issues in the region itself. The epidemic issue, the environmental issue, these things are interlacing, and Venezuela is kind of the vortex in which that's taking place. I was in Colombia on behalf of council business about 1.5 years ago, where we started working with the Colombian government, say, how do we solve this? And one of the things we concluded is that we had to find very innovative ways of refinancing the support for Venezuelans coming in based on a community paradigm. You start at the local level. You can't do it top down, and you allow people to acquire the capability to provide their education, their economic development, their exchange, their health programs. And we have some successful results of that kind of thing, particularly in providing low-cost housing in Colombia for Venezuelan migrants who are coming in. And I think that it's just a demonstration, not nearly at scale, but a demonstration that we have to do some new thinking. And I think there's now an opportunity. I mean, we always like to say, don't put a crisis to waste. Well, I think we're all talking about how do how do we use the revelations and the understanding the epidemic is brought about just the nature of inequity and the nature of sort of suppression that's going on so much in our global system and our regional system. And here's an opportunity, I think, to begin to mobilize. There's a major UN conference coming up, I think in June or July, on the humanitarian crisis that's caused by the Venezuelan the surge of migrants that are affecting the entire sort of region. It's also a plan to start looking at what other kinds of regional networks and architecture do we need. I think what we are showing is a lot of the traditional or conventional ones aren't working. And there's been some efforts, as you know, Nick, on the Quito process and the Lima process to try to get political change. But in the last December election, Maduro just was able to steal it again. And you're going through a country there, you had somebody who wanted to steal an election. You just know how that just provides a huge rupture in the society. So I think my first response is we have to start thinking in the regional case. And coming from Canada, I think here's an area that we could do a lot of cooperative work with the new Biden administration. We've been involved in refugee issues. We've been involved in regional collaboration in the Caribbean and in the Americas. I think if we start putting our heads together and our resources and our best efforts, we can start doing some things together. Maybe bring Mexico in, bring some of the other Americas in. So I really think one of the points I'd like to put out on the agenda is the need for sort of developing this kind of regional collaboration and doing an institutional reset or a renewal so that we actually find the right tools to work on it.
Let me, you mentioned Canada's role in this. Let me actually ask you particularly about that, because it seems to me that one of the constraints worldwide is that we know we have a moral obligation to refugees and in many cases to migrants as well, but politicians also have real political constraints. And, you know, I hugely admired what Angela Merkel did in terms of admitting Syrians, but that also created enormous headaches for her and for people around Europe. But Canada strikes me as kind of exceptional in that it is a place where it seems to me politicians actually perhaps gain politically by doing the right thing. And when Justin Trudeau went to the airport with winter jackets to welcome Syrian refugees at a time when every other country around the world was clanging the doors shut, I was just in awe of Canada. And I guess maybe in particular, because it's not as if Canada has a history of being welcoming. I mean, Canada, of course, I mean, it had a white Canada policy. It was every bit as xenophobic as America or any other country. And yet somehow Canada overcame that past and built up this political will to have a more humanitarian policy. So what's the secret sauce? How did Canada do it?
Well, I'm not sure that it's a kind of a secret potion somewhere in some medicine man's pouch. But I think that we've been lucky in some ways with our geography. We're next to a country where we never have to face large migration. We've been able to choose who comes to Canada. And one of the elements I think is, as the Biden administration moves towards its reform, is that we found it very effective to be able to tell Canadians. I was the immigration minister in the first Prime Minister Trudeau's cabinet, and we were able to tell Canadians that we're in Indonesia, we're in Hong Kong, we're in Malaysia, and we are going to do the selection, we're going to do the vetting. We're doing it in company with the UN and local agencies, but in fact, it means that the government is managing it. It's not simply being responsive to massive surges. I think that's one lesson that should come out. You were talking with Madeleine about it before, about underlying causes. I think part of the problem is that so many of these governments are not really governments. I mean, they're being run by kleptocrats or gangs or whatever it may be. And the sooner that you're going to restore some sense of I think, authenticity and trust in the government being able to manage these things. And I don't think there's any big sort of secret to it. For the caravans coming out of Honduras, help them to come along the way. Make sure that the travel is safe. Make sure that there's places to stop along the way to get proper feeding and looking after the kids. I visited the camps in Tijuana 2 years ago on the American border, And the treatment of women and children by the authorities was just terrible. I mean, it was just awful. So it's not the problem is we still have this punitive attitude towards displaced people and migrants. So that's one element. I think the other element, if I could just kind of make a suggestion or a thought, again, as the new immigration legislation is going to be tabled, I think tomorrow you said, that I think one of the things they should look at is some of the things we discovered about the importance involving ordinary people in a solution. So it's not just somebody else's problem. We have a sponsorship program in Canada. Those Syrian refugees you were talking about, 50% of them came through the actual sponsorship of local church groups or office groups or neighborhood groups. They would look after the refugees. They would provide them for schooling and how to find the bank and basic health needs. And so that as a result, not only did it sort of ease the pressure on the treasury, but it also gave Canadians a direct experience of working with refugees and finding out they weren't criminals or druggies, or they were people who really wanted to work hard and become good citizens. So that's another element. And I think the work, for example, that NDI does is setting up various kinds of election forums and so on, and getting Americans and Canadians and others involved and helping countries to become democracies is part of that kind of direct participation of people, so they can begin to see that they're part of the solution and not simply observers or spectators of what's going on. And I think the third thing would be, I again would recommend, here's an opportunity now to start collaborating, to bring in not just governments in the region, but private sector players, bring in many of the major civil society groups, bring in environmentalists, academics. I mean, there's a former academic, I always believed in academic diplomacy, the kinds of opportunity to provide educational opportunities that we have through the digital system now. I mean, we can do things, we've learned how to do things in the past year in terms of digital learning and communication and exchange and meetings. It can now be applied, I think, on a much broader collaborative system. And therefore, I think, I hate to say this, I don't want to sound kind of, that I'm kind of being sort of dewy-eyed. I think this is an opportunity. But I do come back to your basic point. I think if we don't handle Venezuela and come to grips with it and begin to find, that eventually enable Venezuelans to choose their own government again and not to be suppressed, and at the same time make sure that the 5 or 6 million people, because many of them are going to be forced out not just by the suppression, but by the climate change and the epidemic, find ways that they become settled and stable so that the host countries don't feel that they are insecure about doing it.
I mean, just endorse what you said about the private sponsorship model in Canada. I mean, I was kind of awed to see ordinary groups of Canadians willing to pledge hundreds or thousands of dollars and a lot of volunteer time. And it certainly made the immigrant experience much better, and I think did help build this consensus. So, hats off to Canada for that.
But Nick, I made one point. I think it does come down to political leadership. If you don't have the leadership, and if the leadership doesn't think, but they have to work at developing that consensus. It's not something that is is spontaneous. You have to work at encouraging people to think that newcomers are really important to you socially and culturally and economically, and that they're not sort of people to be feared, but people to be welcomed.
Minister de Avila, let me ask you about this caravan that we've been talking about from Honduras, which has been getting attention in the US, and already some Republicans are criticizing the Biden plan and saying it's, and I think, conjuring this caravan. And so if Joe Biden is watching us today and concerned about the caravan and future caravans, so what do you tell him? How should he think about Central American migration in particular, and how to deal with these issues in the coming months or years?
Thanks, Nick, for having me on. And I would first like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's truly an honor to be participating here side by side with dear friends. I would also like to bring into the table not only the aspect of migrants and refugees, but also of the missing persons. as a commissioner of the ICP, which is created by President Clinton, who just happens to be my friend Madeleine's former boss. It was you, Madeleine, that helped establish ICMP's host state agreement with Bosnia and Herzegovina that ensured the commission could start its work. That was 25 years ago, and we're very happy for those frameworks. So definitely, our region has had a very tough time, a long history of migrations, as you state, but it has exacerbated, unfortunately, this time, as you see in the Americas, it is a new context also of climate immigrants. Climate immigrants is something that we had not seen. If you look right now at the very start of the caravan in San Pedro Sula, it was maybe about 3,500 people. And they started out because 2 months ago, we had a ravaging season of hurricanes, Eta and Iota. It devastated the lives of 6 million people in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. It has affected roads, landslides, agriculture. Even the International Federation of the Red Cross has warned that there is still need of immediate humanitarian support. So it's a combination, very difficult, as Madeleine stated, it's not easy to solve. But here we have first the response that we need to give for humanitarian aid because of the climate crisis. Second, you have the history in regards to the lack of economic opportunities. And here also, there is a question in how the US government has aided the region. Yes, we have received, especially through the Clinton administration began opening up for free trade agreements, and the Bush administration finally signed agreement with Central America, which enables us to generate jobs. And this is a way we should continue to always find also the spaces. But there's the immediate, which is the humanitarian for climate catastrophes, and there's also for the economic opportunities that we need to build. But there's also the political, which we'll have to look at. And there, again, for me, the Biden administration can make enormous contributions to the region by, again, striving on the importance of democracy and downing what is authoritarian rule. Mexico was pushed by the Trump administration and to employ all this force when he threatened to increase tariffs on Mexican goods. So now you see this caravan, it's been met, but militarization from Guatemala, all the southern border from Mexico is militarized. And Guatemalan police have beaten down, the numbers are starting to come down, but many undercurrents continue to come up. So even President-elect Biden spoke with President López Obrador before Christmas exactly on this topic of a renewed immigration policy and to secure a common border. But I do believe that this is an opportunity also to turn the page. And it is a more humane view, as I say, as we come to understand the causes that are there. We have solutions that should be looked at. For example, temporary workers programs, as for example, my country negotiated with Canada, a month's work exchange program specifically for pig farming. But family reunification will always be big in regards to the already more than 500,000 Salvadorans who live there in the US and look for family reunification. To me, Biden has the opportunity to restore much of the respect from the rest of the world by his actions and what he does in regards to immigration. He was in Central America because of the unaccompanied children who were heading towards the US border. He was there to try to solve that. And from my experience, the US, it's the values and the principles that have preceded it that make it stand. And the rest of the countries to be able to support. But it does require definitely a much more cohesive and comprehensive approach so as to be able to stop, and I wish to stop the caravans, because that's talent that is leaving our countries That's talent we need to rebuild. On an example, I was invited to Colombia to speak on the Venezuelan immigration there, to give an example of how we Salvadorans, because we had during the Obama years, enormous deportations that were coming to the region. So what we did was these Salvadorans who had been living in the US had acquired special skills. We have recertified those skills and they're making contributions to the country with that. That example I took to Colombia to try to recertify skilled workers from Venezuela coming in, that, or even Colombians who are coming from Venezuela, to be able to better integrate. But the key point here is integration, is how do we integrate them? And for that, we need the support also that comes from the experience from the Biden administration, but also the political will that can be gotten of the different governments.
Let me ask a little about El Salvador, actually, because I mean, I think one of the reasons to think that addressing underlying conditions and improving governance works is precisely the example of El Salvador, that as governance in El Salvador improved, it seemed that the exit flows declined. And it seems that's a pretty good argument that this works. But conversely, I must say that I was reporting in the highlands of Guatemala, and it struck me that one of the reasons that people did not leave for the United States was that they didn't have the capital to pay somebody, and that actually aid programs to try to give them more of a stake in the local village or economy conversely created a little bit more wealth and gave them the capacity to pay their way to go to the US. So it wasn't obvious to me how those aid programs would actually affect flow. So how should we think of that? To what extent, based on what you see in El Salvador or in neighboring countries, can governance actually give people a stake and make them want to stay and give them a reason to stay, as opposed to giving them resources perhaps to move on?
Yes, no, I definitely agree with you. We have to be able to really go at the root causes and support the people where they need it most. If I look at the 2017 data from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, in Spanish it's called CEPAL, the number one reason why, you get migration from Central America is the lack of employment or the economic crisis at the place of origin of these people. The number two is the very low income or poor working conditions. Even if they get a job, it's insufficient to get them out of poverty and inequality. The third one is violence or insecurity at the place of origin. So if you are, working towards combating these root causes, which again, these are not what I was explaining about the Honduras climate migrants that we have at the moment, but you need time, as Madeleine said. Time, because people do want to be working, but they want it to be in better working conditions. And then one of the big problems that we have right now in the region is the violence, it's the insecurity that comes from gangs. Unfortunately, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala at a point have become one of the most violent regions in the world that are not in a conflict, in some type of civil conflict. And for that reason, you need
We
governance.
exported those gangs to you.
That, Nick, is so correct.
Right.
They came from Los Angeles. They were deported from Los Angeles. They came from, and because it's very profitable for them to establish these, they have gains in their routes, gains from people trafficking, gains from drug trafficking. And there I would like just to add a little comment. Remember, drug trafficking happens because there is a big US demand. So there's a lot that also can be done in the US to curb and slow that demand, so that we, as Central America, we don't consume drugs. It's the pathway that comes from the producing countries towards the north. So definitely, I do believe that in my region, the forced displacement can be caused, but it can also, we can help if we take it into account, and we definitely see it also. in their economic and their social and their cultural rights, so as to be able to, help them, help the people find a way in which they can generate enough for them to have a viable life.
Madeleine, let me ask you about something that I wonder about, that when bleeding heart journalists like myself write about the issue, the metric we tend to use to look at the US, maybe especially in the Trump administration, was the number of refugees, for example, who were admitted, or the number of migrants who are admitted. And yet, and I'm so happy that the US took my dad, who was a refugee from Eastern Europe, and took you as a refugee. But I also wonder sometimes whether the resources and the political capital that have been used for that might be better used to support refugees in, say, from Venezuela who are in Colombia and not getting help, or Syrian refugees in Turkey or Lebanon, and that the same amount of money that is used to resettle one refugee in the US could probably support a dozen in the surrounding countries where they're just swamped by the needs. And so, there's no exact trade-off, but do we overemphasize the metric of numbers admitted versus assistance to surrounding countries?
Well, let me just say the problem is so large that both are needed, frankly. I always say this, and I mean it. Every country has a right to have its immigration policy. It is a sovereign right to, and I am always happier when the United States has a liberal for immigration policy, where we recognize that the numbers of people that can be admitted to the United States is not cut, but is something that reflects what the needs are to a great extent, and that we definitely need all new comprehensive immigration policy. We probably can get back to that. But I also think that one of the other ways to deal with this is to understand that there are countries in the neighborhood that can take people also, and are supporting what goes on in those particular countries is also important. By the way, there is not one subject that all three of us have answered your questions with, are the politics of the issue. They're incredibly complicated. And you look at, for instance, what's going on in the Middle East, where in fact, Turkey is a mixed bag on whether they're taking people or not, and they are using it for their political purposes. And there are questions about how people are treated in camps, for instance, before they can be resettled. One of our colleagues is David Miliband, who is head of the International Rescue Committee. And so we talk about this also, but it takes both, frankly. And if it means that we need to work out some arrangements with X country that is taking people in terms of allowing them to exist in a way that takes them out of the horrors of their own country, I think we need to support that. I think if one looks at, by the way, we are all part of this group of former foreign ministers, and one of the meetings that we had some time ago was how unbelievably disorganized the European Union was as people were escaping by rafts to go to Greece, and then nobody was helping in terms of figuring out what was happening in Greece, and then what happens when some of those people are limited from Hungary's decided that they're not taking anybody. And so, there are an awful lot of political aspects to this, but not everybody has to come to the United States, to answer your question. But I also do think that the US, as it really thinks more in terms of a responsible foreign policy, begins to think of how we can help doubly by, I think, helping those that can be resettled in neighboring countries and helping to work with the other organizational structures that are there. The agenda to change from the horrendous Trump policy internationally is a compilation of all these things. And I do think that one of the things that we're going to have to look at as the American here is in terms of how the whole of government is going to work in the Biden administration and the politics. The politics is, and I want to just go back on something when we were talking about Latin America. The chairman, the incoming chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee is Menendez, and who himself has taken a lot of interest in immigration policy and has been very forward leaning. It's a great opportunity in order to have a better partnership with members of Congress on this, but then also understand the political implications in other parts of the world. But to answer your question directly, you need both, frankly.
And Lloyd, we have this structure we've inherited where there are refugees who deserve protection, and then there are migrants, and then internally displaced people who are in yet another bucket. And does this structure we have really correspond in a useful way to the challenges of the 21st century, where so much is blurred, where people may be fleeing a horrific case of domestic violence or a gang rather than a government? Do we need to rethink the way we analyze and break down these categories?
Well, Nick, the simple answer is yes, we have to do that. Otherwise, we're going to be overwhelmed. I mean, you talked about the metric. The metric now is that with the combined impact of conflicts, corruption, epidemics, climate change, we're talking about a surge of migration that could amount to another 100 million over the next decade or two. That's just overwhelming. And at some point, you know, as much as you want to put up border protection, it just won't hold. So I think we have to find that solution. And remember this, that the whole definition of what is a refugee emerged out of the Second World War based upon the notion of people escaping the Soviet Union. So it was those escaping political persecution. And that's still the template. Efforts to change that are always met with resistance, not just from right-wing reactionaries. It's also met by oftentimes NGOs and civil society who are afraid if you open up that definition, then you're going to kind of crash the whole system. I think what we've been trying to discuss at the council is to say, but there are alternatives. One of the most interesting one I found was what's called the handsome passport, which was used in the League of Nations that gave people who were displaced by a variety of causes the ability to go to another country to work, kids have education, get access to healthcare, but not necessarily become citizens unless there's a pathway towards that. Maybe after, I mean, I was immigration minister, set a pathway of 5 years, and then people could apply as long as they didn't have criminal records. But so there has to be some way of ensuring that people who are forced to displace. Now the question is, how do you pay for it? What do you do? And I think if I can come back to the point I think we've been talking about, the collaborative issue, sharing their responsibility. I think one of the measures we think as a council would be most important would be to have countries like the United States and Canada and Switzerland and Singapore and other places, London, financial centers, to begin looking at ways of repurposing frozen assets. There's hundreds of billions of dollars that have been frozen through sanctions held by kleptocrats, warlords, autocrats, armies. Venezuela is a good case. The most corrupt element in Venezuela right now is the army. They are selling black gold that they mine on the Brazilian border to the Turks, who then resell into the gold market. Not only do they depress the price, but they also have a huge amount of revenue coming back in for the army itself. We got to put a stop to that. And by repurposing, you're simply saying, let courts, let federal courts, judicial courts in different jurisdictions, maybe an international corruption court, as Mark Wolf is promoting, a federal judge in Boston, to say, we'll take these assets and let the judge decide the reapplication of those who have been victimized by the stealing, by the purloining. And all of a sudden, you get two things. You release a large amount of capital and revenue. And secondly, you hold the bad guys accountable. It is a Robin Hood thing. You're using the money to go to the people who need it, who's been stolen from, who are now victimized by it. And you're saying to the Maduros and others, you don't have a piggy bank to go to anymore, because we're going to take those assets and redistribute them to Venezuelans in Colombia and Peru, and help people sort of even in providing humanitarian aid, which is desperately needed. So that's what I come back to the point of, but you can't do that singly. I think part of our problem, as you pointed out, and Madeleine has, we're in this age where everybody thinks that they're an island and that they can put up all the borders and protect themselves that way. Well, we're not going to do that. I think we have to find ways of really integrating our activities and breaking the silos down that we presently have, so that the humanitarian assistance is integrated with climate change adaptation, with anti-corruption measures, with repurposing assets, and that we work together on those kinds of basic priorities.
Mayu, a question for you, and then we have some questions coming in, some great questions coming in from our audience. But Mayu, let me ask about whether we, as you know, whether government officials or as commentators, whether we push too hard for formal approaches as opposed to kind of informal, less optimal approaches that just work. So, for example, in the 1980s and 1990s, for example, in the 2000s, Mexico, southern Mexico, absorbed vast numbers of people from Central America without doing anything formal. It just let people come in, and it didn't give them refugee status. And then when the Obama administration was nervous that this large pool of people would head north, it put pressure on Mexico to formalize this, and Mexico in turn sent many of them back in ways that I thought were morally reprehensible. I and many others urged China to give refugee status to North Koreans who were in northeastern China, and the result was a catastrophe. China simply pushed back. Instead of giving those North Koreans refugee status, it just pushed them back into North Korea. And so I wonder whether we should all be a little more content with informal approaches, sometimes in neighboring countries that are short of refugee status, that are short of what is perfect, short of what is optimal. But
Nick, I think you are right on the money. Neighboring countries such as Mexico and our own Central American countries have generously absorbed many migrants from the region without ever giving them refugee status. At this moment, for example, Mexico offers migrants renewable one-year residencies in Mexico with access to education and health services, only for 1 year, because of how they're getting so many withheld, because as they wait for their answers or replies from the US, but also they want to keep many of them within the country. So I do believe that frameworks allow them to integrate and fill in needed jobs, but we need the frameworks. For example, Belize. Belize is known as the promised land of displaced Salvadoran people. In one of my visits to Belize back in 1999, the Prime Minister, he shared with me that they were now eating local vegetables grown in Belize because of the Salvadoran migrants who took up toiling a difficult landscape and substituted part of the Guatemalan imports. And they had just taken them in because of the conflict that was going on in my country. And the Salvadorans built a shanty town just beside the capital. The capital is called Belmopan. Now that town is called Salvapan. Salvadorans make 16% of the total population, completely integrated, as you said, in a much more flexible kind of way. I do believe refugee status guarantees their personal integrity the best way, but I do agree it is more important to provide a safe haven and a refuge as they run away from gun violence and other causes. but legal frameworks are always needed to accompany, their productive integration into the host country. If not, they easily fall prey to abuse and exclusion. And this is why I link, forced displacement with missing persons, because forced displacement just generates massive irregular migration flows. And we see them in Central America and in the Mediterranean. So if we look at the IOM's data, thousands of migrants died or went missing on the US-Mexico border, Central America, South America. I'm talking about almost 5,000 recorded. Remember, many of them go unrecorded. And the same thing is in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, it's more than 21,000 migrants in those rafts that Madeleine was speaking about right now as they try to reach Greece and other Mediterranean shores. So it is important that that frameworks exist that will allow us, first, for none of them to be missing, and also to be able to incorporate them in a better way, respecting their human rights and also the economic possibilities. But we should be more creative than simply thinking that in this boxed way of refugee status is the only way to go.
We have a bunch of questions covering the gamut, but one that strikes me is about climate, and this has come up briefly. But hitherto we've thought of refugees as fleeing repressive governments or people driven by economic conditions, and I think everybody agrees that in the coming decades, climate is going to be much more of a factor in driving people on. And this person says that a rash of hurricanes has led to massive climate-driven displacement in Central America, with as many as 9 million people impacted by the storms. What can be done to counter food insecurity and basic humanitarian challenges facing Central American countries? And just more broadly, how should we think of climate refugees? Is that the right term to think of? I toss that to anybody who wants to bat at it. But how do we think of climate and all the other hierarchy of needy people?
Well, I do think that there is such a thing, and you can pick any part of the world. For instance, desertification had an awful lot to do with what was happening in Darfur, which contributed to people moving, and then I can go on and link it to the genocide that took place. And so I do think that it is a cause of disruption of major forces, some of which we don't have control of, and some of which we need to figure out how the international system begins to see climate change as something that has to be dealt with. And as I understand it, the Biden administration is going to also announce quickly or immediately that we are going back to the Paris talks, with former Secretary Kerry doing it. So we're seeing it, I think, as a cause of a number of the issues that have to be dealt with, but it definitely is part of the problem.
Nick, if I could just make one quick response, and that is that it comes back to that definitional issue. I think we have to escape from the 1950s and really sort of put a new set of criteria or metrics in place. One of them, frankly, is if you're working on an adaptation to climate, moving towards renewables, moving towards new kinds of agricultural issues, trying, for example, finding ways in El Salvador to begin to restore the water table because El Salvador is running out of water. These are things that you put people who are displaced to working. You help training, give the tools, do some mentoring, enable people through the work that they are dealing with on climate-related disasters or impacts, and put opportunities, economic and social opportunities for people to begin to do that. But right now, because we are working in these silos, the first people who admit that is the UN. You've got a refugee group, you've got a children's group, you've got an aid and development group, and while they talk to one another, the level of integration is not very high. And I think that's why starting at a regional level is so important, and doing some new thinking about that. In this meeting, I think that my my own government's hosting, I think Karina Gould, our development minister, is hosting this UN conference to say, how do we start putting these things together? I mean, let's deal with the immediate crises, but let's also then begin to look a little bit on the horizon, look a little bit forward to say, let's find out how we start melding these kinds of activities. So when we're putting large amounts of money, both public development money, and I hope we get some people working collectively on repossessing stolen assets and the piggy banks of the bad guys, we start putting that money to work in re-employing and reintegrating people, and so that even people who've been displaced or are living in another country can work with the people in this country, and they don't create a backlash or a reaction. They begin to find out that they got mutual interest in a redevelopment based around adapting to the major climate crisis that virtually every region, including, by the way, North America. You only have to look at your fires in California or what's happening in the Canadian North to realize just how much adaptation we need in our boreal forest. There's lots of work to do. We need people to do it, but right now, we're not finding the proper way of redistributing those employment opportunities.
And at this moment, climate refugees don't have any rights. They're
That's
not
right.
recognized within the framework. We're not prepared for them. And I do believe that we have a challenge. First, as governments must comply and adhere to international treaties, such as President-elect Biden will do, but also the private sector has also to gear their own development into a more sustainable framework of work.
We're almost out of time, but there are a number of questions that raise the issue of how do we build political will for a more generous and humanitarian policy toward refugees. James Hathaway at University of Michigan says, is a true refugee protection program a politically viable option? And so I'd just like to ask each of you quickly to address that. And I would just start off by saying that I think that it's a combination of what Lloyd had mentioned earlier about political will, and that it seems to me that in Canada, to some degree, Prime Minister Diefenbaker and much, much more Pierre Elliott Trudeau actually helped make Canada a more welcoming nation. And that Trump did the exact opposite. For example, the political leadership matters, and also that domestic policies matter. I'm from a farm in rural Oregon, and a lot of the local people have a deep animus toward migrants, and that's because the local economy has been catastrophic. And I was just looking at in the U.S. Production and non-supervisory wages adjusted for inflation were lower in December 2020 than they'd been in December 1972. And in that context, people are going to be hostile toward immigration. So some kind of domestic policies, I think, can lead people to feel more inclusive. But just a quick round robin on this. Madeleine Albright, what can we do politically to create the political will to be a more inclusive and welcoming country?
Well, first of all, it does take different political leadership, and I think we're about to have that. I also do think that local groups are very important. I find, for instance, church groups have been welcoming people and are able to explain needs in different ways. And I think that we need to really think about how our society is structured in a number of different private sector, NGOs, various groupings, and empower them in some way to really make a difference. The part that bothers me the most, and I have something that I just wrote, where I said the most dangerous words in the world are us and them. And I think that we have to stop thinking of refugees as them that we don't want, that have nothing, and often put ourselves into other people's shoes. But it is a major job. And I think that it is going to require political leadership federally, state, locally, local councils, and then various groups of people, either teachers or religious people or kids, frankly, who I think don't see the differences and are willing to welcome people into their ranks.
Lloyd.
Nick, let me just provide an answer for someone who was an elected parliamentarian for 27 years. The most important part of my job was winning trust in my constituents. And how did I do that? Being able to do things with them and for them. And that meant that I had to have some autonomy, some ability. I think we've eviscerated our political parties. And certainly oftentimes our legislative branches. I read with horror, that you have to raise millions of dollars to run as a congressman in the United States. I had a constituency the size of a congressional one, and I spent $75,000 because there was real limits on what you could do. And but what I do decry is that members of parliament, legislators, Congress people are not being given the kind of opportunity, the incentive to begin doing policy, to show people that you can be locally based and show up in your office on a Saturday morning, but you can then go to Ottawa or Washington and help draft legislation and ideas. There's not simply kind of the talking seal. And I really think that we've got to rethink a little bit about how we do our politics in all democracies, because I think if we lose that fundamental trust element, then you're not going to have a democracy. And without democracy, you're not going to have good policy.
Maya, what's your take?
Thank you so much. I think always I start from the international aspects and the international frameworks that we need to continue to broaden, especially to include what is climate refugees and in a bigger framework. Coming to the region, there is the OAS with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which have principles in which there is always the possibility to better work with families of migrants and others. Coming even lower into that funnel, I would also agree with Madeleine that it's so important that we incorporate local citizens as primary stakeholders in this say, and that sponsoring, groups, especially within civil society, to support the integration of migrants also is very important as we move on. And in Central America, because we are countries of migration, we do have more capacity or empathy in regards to migrants. For example, we receive migrants from Nicaragua, we receive migrants from Honduras. There is this empathy, and what you have to work with is the local authorities, especially the alcaldías, which are the municipalities, to be able to cement work groups. But again, as Lloyd stated, you need money to be able to give them, to be able to sponsor programs that will train, recognize their skills or train them anew and integrate them. Thank you.
I so much agree with what you said about, the hospitality, people who have so little. And it always struck me in Darfur, these villagers who had nothing would then share their nothing with Darfuri refugees. And I think there's so much we can all learn from that hospitality, whether in El Salvador, in Colombia, or in Darfur. I very much like, we're turning into pumpkins. Thank you all for your time joining us. I'd like to thank the World Refugee and Migration and the Aspen Institute's Aspen Ministers Forum for hosting the panel. And I'd especially like to thank our three very distinguished former foreign ministers, Madeleine Albright, Lloyd Axworthy, and Mayu Brizuela de Avila. People are virtually applauding you all around the world. So thank you so much for joining.
Nick, can I say something? I hope that you continue to write your tear-jerking columns. I think they make a huge difference. You personalize it. So here's to you and what you've been doing in your realm.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. It's a pleasure. God bless.
God bless.